Here we go. So hi, everyone. My name is Shannan Vance-Ocampo. I serve as General Presbyter for the Presbytery of Southern New England. We encompass the states of Connecticut, Rhode Island, and much of the state of Massachusetts as well. We are in the Synod of the Northeast in the Presbyterian Church USA. And today is May 15th, 2020. Our presbytery is set to have its annual meeting tomorrow, May 16th, 2020. And originally, before the COVID-19 pandemic hit the entire world, we were scheduled to welcome the Reverend Irv Porter to be with us tomorrow from the Native American Ministries Office of the National Presbyterian Church. And we were going to spend a number of hours together doing the blanket exercise, which is a way of encountering the history of the theft of land of Native people throughout the Americas over the last 500 years. And so unfortunately, because of the requirements of physical distancing during the time of COVID-19, we are unable to engage this exercise. And it is our plan to do that when we are able to be back and physically together again. But we did want to be sure that we engage this content around the question of our relationship to our Native siblings in this area and to learn and to understand more. So I'm very happy today that Anthony Trujillo, who is a member of New York City Presbytery, he is under care of their Committee on Preparation for Ministry, is able to be with us. I first met Anthony 2 years ago when he was doing his field education work at one of our congregations, First Presbyterian in Hartford, while working on his MDiv at Yale Div School in the bounds of our presbytery. And he'll be beginning PhD studies this September at Harvard University. So I'm really, really glad to welcome you to our Zoom conversation. I was about to say our class, but this is a Zoom conversation today, and to listen a little bit more. So whatever you'd like to share with us by way of introduction would be fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Shannon. And thank you all for the invitation to be with you, to talk and have a conversation. I've been deep in this world of American religious history, and particularly with focus on the Northeast for the last 3 years as a Div School student. And now I'm excited to continue a lot of that work as a PhD student, looking at how essentially how the formation of who we are as a nation is so integrated with our histories with the Native American peoples, and some really complicated, often disturbing histories, and to see how Christianity, and even more specifically the Reformed tradition, is an integral part of that. And I grew up, I grew up in a Baptist church, so being part of the Presbyterian church is new for me. It's been exciting to learn a whole new system structure, and yeah, it's great to be a candidate for ordination. That's where I currently am now, and for me, it's part of this journey of learning both the religious traditions that I'm connected to, and also these places that I'm connected to as well.
That's great, thank you. So one of the things that we've been doing as a presbytery since the last General Assembly 2 years ago almost now is we have been doing land acknowledgements as part of our presbytery meetings. And our meetings are in different regions of our presbytery, and we've been inviting local congregations to do some research about what is the story and what is the history where they are, and to share with us some of that as part of the land acknowledgement. One of the things I was sharing with you on the phone last week when we were talking was years ago in my second call in ministry, I was serving in New Jersey, and that congregation's name is Watchung Avenue Presbyterian Church. That's the name of the street that the church is on. And a colleague of mine was visiting from overseas, and he asked me what the history was of the indigenous people from that land where the church building was. And I was embarrassed to acknowledge at that moment that I had had no curiosity about that, and I had not investigated it at all, and I was unable to answer the question. And he very gently and lovingly, as my friend, chided me and said, "But you know so much about other Indigenous and Native history around your country and around this world. Why didn't you look into it here?" And of course, the name of the Native people in that area was Watchung, and the mountain range, which was near that church, very small mountains, were the Watchung Hills. And so it really led me into that journey of discovery and remembering that for me as a white person and in my own family ancestry of being many generations removed, but knowing that in my ancestral lineage, which is European, that those were people who came in that settler colonial framework to what we now call the Americas. And so I need to always be very mindful of that and consider that as part of my own history, and bring that curiosity to wherever it is that I'm living, wherever it is that I'm serving in ministry. So I've been grateful for us doing these land acknowledgements. So Anthony, I know you were going to share with us a larger version of a land acknowledgement for today, and from where you are particularly located. And I also just wanted to name that that you grew up, we were discussing this as we were starting, and have discussed this a few times before. You grew up in the southwestern region of the United States, which is part of the larger Pueblo region, and the Okayawinge tribe. And so we're glad to have you with us today from those spaces as well. So let's hear the land acknowledgement, perhaps in a different way than we've been doing it the last 2 years, which is fine, but just to open us up to additional ways of considering how we might do those land acknowledgements.
Sounds good. Yeah. So, I mean, as you mentioned, this is not my native home. My Indigenous ancestry is in the Southwest. So it's important for me to also acknowledge that I'm a guest in this space as well. So, and I'm currently located in West Hartford. So I'll go ahead and read the land acknowledgement from here. So today, as we gather virtually, we acknowledge that the Presbytery of Southern New England is situated within the ancestral homelands of the many Indigenous peoples and nations who have inhabited this land historically and today. To my east are the Wampanoag in the Cape Cod area, Narragansett in Providence and Rhode Island, Nipmuc, as we get into Massachusetts, a little bit further up are the Wabanaki Confederacy. To my north, there's the Agawams, the Pocomoks, the Nanantucks, and the Mohicans. To my south are the Nehantics, Mohegan, the Mashantucket Pequot, the Eastern Pequot, and Quinnipiac. To my west are the Scaticoke, Golden Hill, Pagusset, Wappinger, the Pakunuk, and the Lenape. And here where I am in West Hartford are the Seocogs, the Massacos, Tunxus, Wagunks, and Podunks. So I speak these names in order to honor the Indigenous peoples and their relatives who continue to cultivate, protect, and maintain Indigenous spaces, physical, spiritual, and cultural, in the midst of colonized territories. I also speak these names because the spirits of these Indigenous ancestors are all around us, and indeed they are here with us now. And I speak these names as a prayer of blessing for the Native children who have not yet been born, and with a prayer that these descendants would continue to thrive and enjoy intimacy with these lands and waterways for many, many generations to come.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much. One of the other things I wanted us to spend some time touching on today is that you serve in some ways in our larger denomination, both on the Coordinating Council, Native American Coordinating Council, and also the Consulting Committee. And we have a lot of work going on in the larger PCUSA that we should be knowing about and understanding. But before we get to that, I want to continue zooming in on our local area, and then we'll open it up to the larger PCUSA. But I know there's a lot of history in our particular area related to the Reformed tradition and ways in which we have interacted with Native communities in this particular part of the Northeast. And so I'd love for us to talk about that a bit. And then after that, we can talk a little bit about what's going on in our larger denomination today.
Sounds good, yeah. So yeah, as I mentioned, this has been an area of study for me for the past several years. And it's really been interesting. I mean, before I moved up to the Northeast, I was basically had a similar set of stories as many folks in the United States grow up with around, you know, pilgrims coming to
so go ahead, Anthony. We lost you for 1 second, but we were on the pilgrims.
Yeah, and actually, as many of you all know, this year, this fall, will be the 400-year anniversary or commemoration of the Plymouth Landing. And that, for many people, is considered like the beginning of United States history, at least. But the Native history here in this region is tens of thousands of years longer than that. And as I think as part of that, it's important to remember that from the very beginning, that Native people have been engaging with the settlers in whatever capacity they came, whether they were as refugees, as colonizers, and all the various waves, like century or generation after generation, century after century. And so from the very outset, there's been a deep engagement of Native people with the Reformed tradition, because many of the folks who were coming to this region were intimately connected to the Reformed tradition, although it became the congregational church in many cases in this region. But still, the Presbyterians and Congregational have that same root of Reformed theology, which is grounded in ideas of covenant, God's sovereignty, the Bible, providence. And it's interesting to think about, when we orient ourselves with a land acknowledgement, part of what we're doing is we're orienting ourselves temporally, that we are situated within personal histories, familial, communal, denominational, national histories. And this prompts us to ask a set of questions, and that is, how did my story or your story in this place get started? If our families came from elsewhere, if we are aliens living in other people's places of intimacy, how did we get here? Would we be considered legal or illegal aliens, and according to whose principles? And what stories do we tell ourselves? Or have we told, or have those who have come before us told themselves to naturalize themselves to this place? And what happened in the lead up to the fall of 1620 when the Mayflower landed on Wampanoag shores, and in the decades and centuries afterward, that caused indigenous homelands to be rebranded as New England. The names of some of our towns and cities give us a bit of a hint. So here in Connecticut, we have places like New Canaan, Lebanon, Hebron, Basra, Goshen, and Providence. So part of what happened is that, the Bible happened. The Bible, that's where we get all of these names here, many of the names here in the Northeast. And another thing that happened is Reformed theology happened. So things like Providence, and an idea of, or a city named Providence, and the idea of covenanting, and that people were here under God's sovereign hand guiding them to this land. And at the same time, those instruments of guidance also became instruments of displacement for the many indigenous peoples who called this place and still call this place home. Vine Deloria Jr., who's a native theologian and or legal scholar, has a wide breadth of scholarship, asks a question this way. He says, where did Westerners get their ideas of divine right to conquest or manifest destiny, of themselves as the vanguard of true civilization? And I would add, as an exceptional or a chosen people, if not from Christianity and from the Bible. So these are some of the questions that we, who are the inheritors of these histories, and in many cases of the land, have to ask ourselves. And I think this raises the question of like, how comfortable and confident can we be when with the book and the tradition that have been so central in shaping us and guiding us as a denomination and as congregations and as individuals have often been wielded like sharp double-edged swords or axes to hew down indigenous peoples and their traditions like forests in order to make space for our cities and churches and homes. So, whether we are old comers or new timers, or I said that wrong, old timers or newcomers to the Presbyterian Church or to North America, these are some questions that should probably make us feel a little bit unsettled. And I think that's okay. It's a good place to start, is to feel like we're in between, we are living in the space of somebody else's intimacy, of indigenous people's intimacy with this place that they have cultivated for millennia. So those are some of I think the bigger themes and questions that get evoked when we think about our Reformed history in this place, of the indigenous people who have been displaced, although many are still here, and the relationships that we have to think about. How are we going to cultivate these relationships, to address these particular histories that we are situated within?
It's so interesting to hear you speak about all of that, because of course so many, and this is throughout the United States, of course, is so many of the names of our congregations are names of towns or names of sometimes streets or waterways, and so many of these names have been co-opted or taken the place of the original names of those places. I remember when I first visited our congregation, you brought up New Canaan. What I learned was that that town was that the UCC church, which is down the street from our congregation. Oftentimes, all of these Protestant churches are also on the same street in this part of the country. It's as the towns, we have the older towns in the United States in this part of the country, and so are some of the older towns, and everything's sort of neatly right up in a line on the same street. And the UCC's property is called God's Acre. And that's what everybody in town calls it. And I remember when I first heard that, I thought, whoa, that's a lot, that's kind of amazing. And so there is this real, shifting of naming that goes on. And I grew up, most of my childhood, I grew up in Philadelphia. And so of course, everything was about colonial history in Philadelphia. And constantly being immersed in that as a child and young adult growing up. And so, you get if you're lucky, you get, a month or so of Native American history in your class growing up, and maybe not even every year in your education. Even as I've watched my own daughter go through school, there's just been these little chapters here or there, or sort of a nod at Columbus Day, which is, incredibly problematic. So we don't really get much history. And even as I look back at my seminary education, we have the history of the Reformed movement, but nowhere in there did we ever have any discussion, not one time that I can remember in seminary, in any of what we did about, it's just sort of like we were arrived and we were always there as Reformed Christians, not about what was actually present before we arrived and were there. And of course, the history of, when you think about it, of the United States, if you think about it just from the landing, is really a very young history in the United States. Really, 400 years is not very much history at the end of the day. So it's quite amazing how much this Euro-Protestant ability to take over naming and histories, and to just the erasing that goes on, and the ability to erase is fairly breathtaking, and for me, scary at the same time, because it eliminates our knowledge of so much information, and especially eliminates our knowledge of ecological information.
Yeah, and I think that's
another big piece of our theology, right? We're so disembodied ecologically.
And something I think a lot about is that, this question of intimacy, right? And this is when a people's language emerges out of a particular ecology, so the various Algonquin dialects, up and down the eastern seaboard. Just as with Tewa, my native language in New Mexico, or current day New Mexico, these are languages that emerge out of like this, what I would call communion with this place, and it shares so much insight and information about, and not only information, but relationship. And not only language, but ceremonies, songs, story traditions. These are all part of what make that, create an intimacy with, the indigenous ecology, as people interact with that space over thousands of years. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot there that we still have yet to mine on sort of all of our traditions and interrogate, I think. That erasing doesn't even give us the imagination oftentimes to even know what questions we even need to ask, or what things are even missing. It's just so total and complete, which is kind of the point, right? So
yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I guess a couple more things on just some of the history here is also that Native people have been really deeply engaged with the Reformed tradition, like from the outset, in part because so many of the colonial charters, part of, in fact, the underlying rationale for settling this place was to Christianize the Native people. But whether that's in Massachusetts or the Massachusetts Bay Colony or here in Hartford, that's one of the underlying provisions, like why this land was granted to the colonists. But part of that is that Native people were part of that process. They were in conversation from that very beginning. In fact, the first book that was published in the colonies was what the Massachusetts Bible, also known as the Eliot Bible. Actually, a friend of mine, Hillary Wiss, has written this book called Writing Indians, and on the front is this picture, a little snapshot of the Algonquin Bible. So it's the first book published by, translated in, collaboration with or overseen by John Eliot, but by Native people were the translators. It's super interesting to see some of the archives around here in the region have original copies of that. And then speaking of naming, up here in the Northeast and pretty much everywhere, there are markers of another major event called King Philip's War, which Metacomet, there's a Metacomet trail I go hiking on. Lisa Brooks has written this amazing book, Our Beloved Kin. She's a professor at Amherst College. I think we might be getting kicked off here in just a minute, or maybe not. But that's another really good book to kind of bring in some of the indigenous history to this region. And then in the 19th or 18th century, there were many Native people who embraced, and actually all the way through, had embraced, whether it was some variation of the Reformed tradition. Congregational, Presbyterian. Samson Occam was from Mohegan, right down on the Thames River, up from New London. The first first ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church. He was actually ordained in Long Island, on Montauk. He was a teacher out there, and at that time, and actually for much of the history of 17th, 18th, 19th century history, denominations had their regions. So Long Island, New York, were Presbyterian. Up here was Congregational, and y'all probably know this. So that's how Samson Occam became a Presbyterian minister, was being ordained out there on Long Island. So these are some of there's been engagement all the way through. And there's a lot of books, a lot of scholarship about the Native side of these histories that I think sometimes may not be as, people might not be as familiar with. So there's a lot there.
Right, and there is still a Native congregation in Long Island Presbytery,
yep. Mm-hmm.
out on the south shore of Long Island, and Holly Haley Thompson, first Native woman ordained in the PCUSA, has been part of that community. Has also served in other spaces around our larger synod community. So we've got,
mm-hmm.
We've got a lot of interesting pieces to our history. So tell us about some of your work with the PCUSA these days. What's going on in the PCUSA? What's this coordinating council? What's this consulting committee? What's happening? And of course, we also have a non-geographic presbytery, the Dakota Presbytery out west in the denomination. So a little bit of history for those of us that around this presbytery who might not know some of that larger sphere of what we're doing today in Native American ministry, and also in connection and some reparation work around the denomination.
Yeah, so yes, I'm on two committees. One is the Native American Coordinating Council, in response, which is a GA, General Assembly mandated or created council to coordinate responses to the denomination's expanded response to the Doctrine of Discovery. So for those who may not be familiar with the Doctrine of Discovery, the Doctrine of Discovery was the legal and theological doctrine that allowed European nations, or that was devised by European nations, and then used to acquire, to steal indigenous lands actually around the world, in our case here in North America and in the Northeast. That legal it was first produced by the Pope in, let's see, it was in the 1500s, I believe.
1519.
No, it was in the 1400s. Yeah, yes. Yeah, it was in the 1400s, like a papal bull, and then essentially, well, I won't get into that's a deep rabbit hole. The idea was that God had given all lands of the world to the Pope, or to Christians, in order to Christianize, and the Pope was in charge of distributing that land at that time between the Spanish and the Portuguese. Well, the English and the French wanted to get in on that, and they developed their own ways to use that same doctrine to acquire lands in North America, many parts of North America. And so New France, New England, and then after the American Revolution, there was a question of like, so what are these native nations, and what are all these treaties, and what are all these, how does this new country relate with native nations? And in the 1823, John Marshall was a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He oversaw a case called Johnson v. McIntosh, which enshrined the Doctrine of Discovery into the American legal system. And I'll just read you a little quote from that decision, which kind of gives you both the legal and religious aspects of that, of the law. So it says, the right of discovery given by this commission is confined to the countries then unknown to all Christian people, and of these countries, Cabot, who was an explorer, was empowered to take possession in the name of the King of England, thus asserting a right to take possession notwithstanding the occupancy of the natives who were heathens, and at the same time admitting the prior title of any Christian people who may have previously made a discovery. So essentially, that doctrine is still the active law in the United States that makes native nations people who occupy territory, but at the same time, I'm trying to pare this down so that it doesn't get too complicated. So the Doctrine of Discovery, in effect, continues to be active and continues to be used as the fundamental doctrine that establishes the relationship between native nations and the United States. So the question is, how has the Presbyterian Church been a beneficiary, and not only a beneficiary, but a counterpart with the United States government in enacting laws and policies and in acquiring these lands?
An incredible amount of land, if we think about all of the holdings of the PCUSA today. If we just imagine that for a moment, the amount of land that is taken up, the amount of space that is taken up, and the amount of wealth that has been generated, right? This is a piece of us being as a church really in bed with an economic model and in bed with a legal model, which is very much theft based. And so that's a huge theological question for us as Christians and as people who may be in a very different place today, but we are still benefiting deeply from those things. And we have enshrined, right, even in our polity in the PCUSA, the trust clause, which says, everything is held in trust for the denomination, right? And so it's a very sort of perpetuating sort of a piece that we have and how we relate to land. And that question of land sovereignty. And one of the things that came up, as you know, I'm on the mission agency board, and we received a report. Maybe it was begun before I got on the board. I didn't even know that this was going on, but we at the last meeting received the property report because there was a study done of all Native American properties within the Presbyterian Church USA and what the status was and what the needs were around repair work and code work and all of this related to these properties and funding for that. So, this sort of land question continues to very much be with us in all sorts of ways in the church.
Absolutely. And actually the Doctrine of Discovery Committee, so after giving that overview of, or trying to, of what the Doctrine of Discovery is, and I mean, the other term that people might be more familiar with is manifest destiny. The idea that it was inevitable that the United States acquire land from sea to shining sea. We even sing that song. So it's become embedded, so deeply embedded both in our national and in our denominational history. And the question that we've been tasked with is, well, for one, and I'd say primarily making recommendations to this upcoming General Assembly on how the denomination can support Native Americans in our ongoing efforts for sovereignty and fundamental human rights. So given this history and all these various displacements, so part of what that entails, so we've made recommendations to the General Assembly for this upcoming, which I don't think are going to be taken up because of the COVID-19 situation.
Right. You all are on the list of things that are getting tabled and moved off to another assembly.
Yeah.
So we have to, another reason to have these conversations and keep it alive, because we're not going to look at it. And it, again, given how we've been for, generations and decades and hundreds of years, erasing and forgetting is really easy for us to do, especially in the church. So that aliveness of that conversation is going to be important now between assemblies, with so little work being able to be accomplished because of the COVID situation, right?
Mm-hmm. And, one of the interesting things is that in many cases, I mean, speaking of the native properties around the country, in many instances, these were actually part of treaty negotiations between the US government and Native nations when they were establishing these churches, all over the country. And part of that was to, that the government and the denominations would set up, mission schools and churches. Sometimes those are boarding schools where Native people were taken and given re-education, essentially to break them from their Native traditions. But in some cases, they were actually invited because Native people recognized the need to learn to read and to write, so that they could advocate for themselves. So it's really complex when you get into some of these reasons, like why are there churches? Why is there a church at Shinnecock? Why is there a church, in Laguna Pueblo? And part of it has to do with, this relationship. And I think one of the important things to realize is that in many cases, Native people and Native nations entered into a relationship with the government and with denominations as in a mutual give and take type of relationship. There was an idea that, yes, you can have some space here, but it's not an overarching takeover. And that there was expected to be a dialogue between both between the ministers, and there was also supposed to be a relationship of upkeep. So, who was expected to maintain some of these spaces? Who was going to train the ministers? Who was going to, these are some of the negotiations that were part of these conversations that I think, many years distant, it's easy to forget about those things that, and like you said, even in our seminary training, there's not a whole lot of training specifically designed for either, whether it's training Native ministers or non-Native ministers to know, these histories so that they can actually live responsibly, because those are still alive and active. If we think of federal Indian law, like the Johnson v. McIntosh law as being alive and active in the United States and determining policy. Well, among Native people, these treaties are absolutely active, and they require there's a responsibility, whether that's a government responsibility or even a denominational responsibility, to make sure that those congregations, the properties even, and the communities are cared for. So I think that's something that is really important to learn, is like that reciprocal relationship, a give and take, versus unidirectional, like, you know, kind of a my way or the highway approach that has kind of historically been the relationship between Christian churches and Native nations.
Yes, and as I serve at the national level, one of the things I see is that we have two folks on the mission agency board who are Native, and it oftentimes, we have to listen very carefully, and we have to ask and pause so that we just don't keep sort of railroading and moving forward without ever considering impact on Native communities, questions of Native communities. It is oftentimes, I have learned serving on this board, where we're really called to task oftentimes, because it's just, unfortunately, we are still learning to pause and still learning to stop, and to just ask some different questions, even as we're doing the regular business of our board. And I think that's just a learning overall for the larger church to have, that oftentimes we have to stop and pause because we're so used to being in that exceptionalism mode, and we're so used to being in that dominant role that we don't even think that we need to stop and pause. It's just not even part of our imagination or our vocabulary, which is not a good thing. I'm not saying this is a good thing, but it's how we are. And unlearning those habits of dominance for a dominant group, and that awakening that is required, that self-confession, is very challenging, and takes it takes as long to undo those behaviors as it has taken to build them up, which means it's a generational project for us as the church. But certainly, I think a project that is probably the most faithful one we can take up these days in the life of the church. So that work is just really important, and it really is that constant learning to do that.
Yeah, and speaking of, confession and repentance, core parts of, the Reformed tradition. This is part of the mandate in the expanded response to the Doctrine of Discovery, is to call congregations to confession and repentance, and a confession including an exploration of local history of how the land was acquired from indigenous nations, and also repentance, and thinking about how the development and implementation of a strategy for entering in dialogue. This is the action with these communities, and there are a number of those here in the Northeast, and reflection for discernment on how to enter into relationship, and to be educated, I think, in these histories, and what does the current moment require?
Right, and we have the other example in our larger synod community, of course, is the example of the Presbyterian Church in Stony Point. This is not the Stony Point Center land, but down the street from the Conference Center land is the Stony Point Presbyterian Church, which was a smaller congregation, has been for years, and was being, the congregation had voted to cease operations, and it was a work of years between the Ramapo tribe in that area that had developed a relationship with the Stony Point Center and with the Presbytery of Hudson River to decide to do a land reparation, and was not without controversy in that Presbytery, of course. And one of the things, we have a document, it's in our resource folder for our Committee on Ministry for congregations that are considering closing, which is something that's happening, of course, around the country, and various ways and methods of closing. And I had added into that document, which is a couple pages long, of various things that could happen, creative ideas for congregations. And I had added in reparation as one of those. And I've had a few folks ask me about that, and I, point kind of next door to our neighboring presbytery to Hudson River to say, this is an actual thing we could do. It has happened. It is a possibility. We should have it on our list of possibilities, because again, if we don't name it, we may not remember it, or we may not know it. And so this is a very early piece of work, but how do we return land? How is land returned responsibly, in a non-dominant sort of way? That's like a whole other conversation for a whole other day, right? But it's definitely something that we are at the very early steps of grappling with, related to all these holdings of the Presbyterian Church, right?
Exactly. I mean, and I think there are real ways that the denomination and even local congregations, middle councils, can take steps to begin unraveling. I mean, I think it's always a beginning. It's always a starting, because there's so much work to do. But begin to peeling back these layers. Some of the recommendations that we put in as a Doctrine of Discovery, or the coordinating council for the Doctrine of Discovery, was, let me just get a couple up here. What is exactly what you just said: encourage the return of indigenous lands and territories, to Native nations, especially in instances of closing, to make that part of the conversation. Encourage, continue to support the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Another thing that is really important among Native nations is retaining language. Part of the history is that Native people who went to boarding schools or who were in missionary churches weren't allowed to speak their native languages. And so trying to address that rupture by thinking about creative ways that denominations and congregations can support Native nations in reclaiming and maintaining and perpetuating language, ceremonies, song traditions, story traditions, those things that both forge connection with kinship connections with land. There's a lot of different ways, I think, working in multiple levels that I think should be part of the response.
Right, and that some of that response is a response rooted in our tradition, and the Christian tradition of healing, but then healing is also part of the Native traditions. And so, but healing has many facets and many levels to it. So those are pieces where really interesting conversations could be happening. So let's talk a little bit about sort of our local space here in the Presbytery. We have a lot going out on the Cape Cod part of our presbytery, the far eastern edge of the land that this presbytery is on, and some of our own history and some of the things you think that are really important for us to be considering at this time, especially related to this this issue with the Mashpee tribe out on the Cape. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, that's great. So as you noted, the Mashpee Wampanoags, this is I guess a part of the Native Nations, or one of the Native Nations that was there when the settlers arrived, or the refugees arrived 400 years ago. And now they're currently in legal battles to maintain their tribal lands. And to actually not only to maintain their tribal lands, but they had been approved as an official, federally recognized nation within the last decade, I believe. And then there have been a number of challenges mounted against that approval, trying to undermine their federal recognition. In one thing, I think, before getting into the specific issues currently going on. Mashpee have, as with Pequot, Mohegan, there are federally recognized tribes in this region, and there are many non-federally recognized tribes. And I think it's important to realize that that's a political designation, but it doesn't mean that people aren't still here.
Right. Yeah.
And and that can be part of the narrative that happens in the Northeast, is that Indian country is like out west somewhere. Well, no, Indian country is like right here. Actually, we live within it. It's and there are Native nations here that have been surviving and thriving for generations. One of the things that the Mashpee Wampanoags have been doing is that they have a Wampanoag language revitalization project. So that's been ongoing. And Jesse Littledoe-Baird has been instrumental in actually using the Algonquin Bible, the Wampanoag Bible, as the resource for reclaiming and bringing the Wampanoag language back into the life of the community. So it's been really amazing to see that particular history and story. So there's a lot of efforts. Sovereignty is a word that's really interesting to think about because it's a theological term, but among Native communities, it's become a way of essentially saying that Native nations have the right to govern ourselves. The inherent right. It's not a right that's given by the U.S. government. It existed prior to the U.S. becoming a nation. So we have an inherent right to govern ourselves. There is a federal process by which now Native nations are able to get federal recognition, which the Mashpee did, as with here in Connecticut, the Mohegans and the Mashantucket Pequots, Narragansetts. And but that's definitely under threat at this point. In part, this gets into another whole thing of casinos. There's a lot of people who are really displeased with the fact that part of what Native nations have found to be a way of generating revenue, jobs, and being able to support their tribe, everything from education to government, healthcare, has been revenue coming from casinos. As part of this conversation, I'm going to send over a list of resources, and part of that will be a number of links about what tribal sovereignty is, and some of which deals with casinos. Right. Because I know it can be one of those things that's really contentious, especially with for non-Native people trying to think of why is this Native tribe trying to the only reason they want to become federally recognized is so they can build a casino.
Right. Well, and then we get into issues of, we could talk all day, right? But then we get into issues of paternalism, issues of racism, issues of all sorts of, other sort of pieces of commentary. And then you get into issues of sort of Puritanism, right, in the church, where we say, we're anti-gambling as a church, but then, sort of as we peel back the layers on that, it's not so easy. And what's really behind some of that, and that begins to peel back into some other pieces of, the legacy of white supremacy in the church, and us telling others how to conduct themselves and what is and isn't acceptable conduct necessarily. So this isn't sort of a commentary on gambling, but but it really, it invites us to really peel back the layers, I think, and dive deep into those other questions and what's being masked, by sort of a surface level conversation about gambling, right, on the surface, where we don't really interrogate, sort of peeling back that onion, what are the layers, and thinking about some of those larger pieces, because, we're oftentimes just, and certainly there's plenty of issues with addiction and gambling and those are all definite things to have concerns over, of course, but you know, what's behind it and what's behind some of those larger pieces. So
Yeah, thanks for mentioning
the reason for us to be really sort of have that mind of interrogation and of curiosity, and also really looking at ourselves, you know, as, you know, if we take our traditions, you know, very seriously, that interrogation becomes so important. So we're not committing additional harm, or we're not participating in some of those legacy things that are so deep seated within us as a mostly white church, that are that cause that erasing, and then we don't even go deeper, and we don't even look at what the harm is that we're engaging in or participating in, even unconsciously.
Yeah, and this is why I think it's really important to come back to tribal sovereignty, inherent tribal sovereignty. It's something that exists, that Native nations have, and the right to govern ourselves or themselves, you know, to make decisions that really promote the thriving of their community. And rather than applying the moral lens, you know, because, you know, the fact of the matter is, I mean, there's a long history of, exactly as you said, of paternalism and moralizing the displacement of, and the displacement or the disenfranchisement of Native people. And that's kind of what is going on right now at Mashpee. There's a court, actually not only at Mashpee, but around the country, there are court cases that are really trying to challenge tribal sovereignty of specific nations. There's a current case down in the Supreme Court right now for the Muskogee Creeks in Oklahoma. And we see this also coming up in the Dakotas with the which one of the Dakota, or maybe several Dakota nations, setting up checkpoints to test people who are coming in and out of their reservations because the local and or state governments aren't being as vigilant as the Native nations think they need to be in order to protect tribal members. So, and all of this has to do with sovereignty and the ability to, you know, like, to say, hey, that, you know, this is the territory that is, you know, either our ancestral homeland, and that we are tasked, we're mandated to make sure that we can continue living in this place for generations to come. And so right now, just a brief overview, the Mashpee Wampanoags have been fighting in court to maintain their tribal sovereignty after that was granted because of some legal challenges. A casino owner, apparently, I mean, this is a real, I mean, there's a lot of news articles, I would say, you know, dig deeper into this. But part of the story is that there's a casino owner who's gotten upset that the Mashpee Wampanoags were granted sovereignty because it's a threat to a project they're hoping to build, and now has kind of leveraged or lobbied both government officials to disenfranchise or disestablish the nation, which about a month ago, I believe, maybe even 2 at this point, the Secretary of Interior issued a proclamation essentially doing that, taking away their land. That has been put on pause, and it's currently going through court, and actually there's a hearing on May 20th in the Senate as to whether or not, you know, the Senate will vote as to whether or not they have the right to be a Native nation. I mean, they've already proven their history. There's a whole set of criteria, and it's so long and rigorous. You have to put stacks and stacks and stacks of documentation together to become a federally recognized tribe, and they've done that, and they've been granted that. And this is, the power rests with Congress to either to grant or to take away federal recognition. And so that's what's coming up on May 20th. And that can actually, the hearing will be broadcast live.
Wow.
But it's also a call to action, I think, is to learn about this particular issue because it's a pressing one, not only for Mashpee, but for Native nations around the country who have a similar, or are facing similar threats.
Right.
And to, to write letters to representatives and government officials.
Right, and questions of tribal sovereignty, the Standing Rock Coalition, and considering issues of, again, getting back to land, getting back to the environmental issues related to sovereignty, the economic issues, and even within the bounds of our, of this presbytery on the Mashpee land, just stunningly amazing. The level that we go to in this country in a year that is the anniversary, right, of the landing, even, and that this was the original tribe that welcomed those people, and so there is this real, sort of confluence of things happening, and it is it's somewhat stunning. The levels to which that, we still go in this country in terms of exercising harm to Native communities and also harm to tribal sovereignty. I know that the United Church of Christ has spoken out in support of the Mashpee tribe, and that there's other ways that we can be in solidarity with them during this time. So we'll be putting some of that information out alongside this, but it's definitely a local issue, but also tied to those, as you said, those larger issues that we've been involved in, and the Presbyterians have been involved in other places. There was a large delegation that went and spent time at Standing Rock. The apology from a few General Assemblies ago was read at Standing Rock by the Presbyterian Church. So there are these things that are happening, but how do we, tell those stories in deeper ways within our congregations, within our local communities, and really have our antenna up for what's going on locally can be really, really key and important.
Yeah, another one of the things that's, just to kind of put it out there, is that, there's a whole issue of mascots, and that's, with the Washington, D.C. pro football team being one of them, but it's also has all kinds of iterations, including here in Connecticut with Thornsley, and also Farmington have football teams named, like either Indians or Red Men or something along these lines, which are just, they're incredibly demoralizing. And, it's like, it racializes sports in a way that is completely unnecessary. And in fact, some of these, like Killingsley, for example, the name was removed, and then a town board, brought it back because they had a nostalgia for the name, So these are things that are happening like all around us. In part, I think it's because, for one, people think that Native people, again, aren't here anymore and aren't affected, and that it's a way, it can often be something is branded as, it's a way of honoring Native people, but if the Native people don't feel honored, why are you doing it?
Right. Exactly.
And so these are things that it has to do with respect. It has to do with really being conscious of who we are and where we are. And so many of these people are church-going people. So many, and I think what it really causes us to come down to is let's think about the golden rule. I mean, it's a biblical thing. You know, it's like the lowest bar. Do to others what you want them to do to you. Don't do to others what you don't want them to do, not to do, yeah, to do you. And like, if we were to engage in that kind of way with Native communities, Native people in this area, I think that's one of the ways of beginning to start those conversations in that relationship.
Right. Or even, you know, seeing ourselves as all children of God, and seeing ourselves because of our designation that is not one we make, but it's one that God makes about us, that there is a holiness and a sacredness to each of us. But when we do these things that chip away at that holiness and at that sacredness, what we're really doing is we're chipping away at who God has named us to be, and we're basically saying we don't, you know, we're defying God, I think, in doing that, when we're defying that original designation, if we truly believe that. So I think it's a real question of some of the basics of our theology, some of the basics of who we are, if we are given the creation to care for it. What does that really mean at its deepest levels? What does that really mean at its deepest levels, and how we engage in and live alongside each other and alongside the other creatures of the creation, that we are one of other creatures. We are not the creature, but we are one of others. So it is, those are, you know, sort of very ingrained and deep theological questions, but ones I think because of that issue of exceptionalism, that manifest destiny, we've been even stripped of the imagination to have those theological conversations. I think we're beginning to reawaken to them to a degree, but it's going to take us so long to keep even having them, or even interrogating them, I guess, is what I'd like to say. It's
You know,
a big piece.
Yeah, I think about two things in relation to our theology, and like how this might relate with Indigenous relation, or to Indigenous relations, and it comes down to our two sacraments, yeah, baptism and communion. Right. And for me, and you know, that's where baptism is, where, you know, who we are as people is affirmed. I mean, it's our baptism is, you know, we're brought into Jesus's baptism. When we're baptized, we hear the words that God spoke to Jesus, right? You are my beloved child, and you I take great delight. And when we think about that, you know, Jesus was an indigenous Nazarene. He's an indigenous person from a different part of the world. But when he hears those words, everything about him, his body, his language, the color of his skin, you know, his history, the land and the water that he's like entering into, like, that he's immersed into when he's baptized. Baptism can be such, you know, it within the history of Native Christianity, baptism, and even within not Native Christianity, has been used as like breaking away of one's sinful nature. And that's an important dimension of it. But there's also an important dimension of immersing oneself in those words of belovedness. And those are, you know, that Native people should be able to hear those words for ourselves, for who we are, for our languages, our ceremonies, our land. So there's a way in which I think baptism really opens that up. And I also think about communion, which is like, you know, this is exactly what Native ceremonies are. At the heart of Native ceremonies is about communing, you know, through with the spirit world, with the human, with other human communities, with the not other than human communities, birds, or, you know, animals, plants, flora, fauna. You know, this is exactly what Native ceremonies are all about, is about entering into a deep sense of communion with everything that's around us.
Right.
And, I think if Christians, if Presbyterians, if Reformed theology was allowed itself to be influenced in some ways, in many ways, by indigenous ways of thinking about even the sacraments. Like, what does this mean? I think it would change the way that we relate with Native communities here that we live alongside, and also, all the beings that that make up our, I guess, the worlds that we live within. We're not, like, as you said, we're not the one creature. There's so many that we have to figure out a way of communing with.
Right. Yeah, it's if we would allow ourselves to get beyond our theologies that inhibit our ability to really know God and to know the diversity of who God is in the creation, it's almost unlimitless if we could just expand our vision just even slightly. But there's a lot to go in those directions, for sure. The other thing, of course, you would have been with us tomorrow in person, and we would have been doing the blanket exercise, which is one of my big griefs personally of the week. I was really looking forward to doing this with the Presbytery and then having Irv with us. And of course, this pandemic has stolen all sorts of things from us. And for our Presbytery, this experience tomorrow together is what we are losing in our gathering. We will be over Zoom tomorrow, but not in person. But there's larger issues of health-related outcomes, of the history of disease in Native traditions, from conquering traditions, using that as a way of extermination. That's something we would have talked about tomorrow in the blanket exercise and physically walked through and experienced. But of course, and the Presbyterian News Service did a really good article, I thought, about this that they just put out in the last 24 hours. But of course, it's been in the national press as well, which is the infection rates among Native persons in the United States with COVID-19, and especially what's going on in Navajo Nation. And Doctors Without Borders has gone into Navajo Nation this week because of the lack of health infrastructure and the lack of resources which have been made available to Navajo Nation. And so I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about some of these health-related issues, especially in this specific time of pandemic that we're all living through.
Yeah, I guess for this, I'll talk a little bit. For one, I think it's really important that folks figure out what's going on within their own local areas and communities. There's the Indian Health Service is the federal program for Native Americans that has branches and hospitals and clinics all around the country. So that's one place I think to go to get like really site-specific information. There's the National Indian Health Board. It's actually a nonprofit organization, and they have they're broken up into regions as well. So that's a place to get specific information about regional, like what's going on regionally. One thing that's I think really important to think about is that there are so many Native, actually the majority of Native people don't live on reservations and have to access healthcare through probably one of the, excuse me, the Indian Health Service clinics that are in urban areas. And those are direct, like just incredibly underfunded. So from a national level, the Indian Health Service is, I believe it's like, I don't remember exactly the statistic, I don't want to misquote, but it's like the per capita allotment that the Indian Health Service receives is like drastically lower than what non-native communities receive in health services. So that's like a national, ongoing crisis, you could say. And the fact that many native people, are actually in urban areas, Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, Boston even, and Providence, and may not have access to reliable health care. So I think it's important to have that broad view of what's going on. And then within tribal nations, within native territories, the Navajo Nation, is definitely one of many that are struggling to get federal resources. I need to check back in on this, but as of like a week or so ago, they had not received federal assistance, whereas like funds had been flowing for over a month or longer. Into non-native communities, and native communities weren't getting those types of resources.
Well, and one news story I saw, they were actually shipped, the assistance that they were shipped from the federal government were body bags.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't get more obnoxious, right, than that. So it's or direct of how we are interacting these days. So the lack of clinics on native lands, the lack of the distance to get to healthcare facilities, and then, as you said, the ongoing crisis of care in Native American communities and lack of care, so that are in higher risk groups, are higher propensity to, if exposed to COVID-19, to have other interlocking health issues that would make them at much higher risk, lack of ability to be able to be physically distant, all those things that those of us that are so highly privileged at this time, that privilege allows us to stay well, where so many other communities are not granted those privileges and therefore are at higher risk of this very scary airborne infectant that we're still trying to figure out and understand. I mean, neither one of us are scientists, but we read all the science, and it's even the doctors aren't really able to wrap their arms around this yet. It's still so new, and they're trying to figure it out.
So down in New Mexico, Arizona area. So my brother is actually he lives out on the Navajo Navajo Nation. He works at the hospital in Fort Defiance, Arizona, which is where one of their major hospitals is. And I mean, just from talking with him, well, for one, in many cases, there might be people have to go out and get water and bring that back. So there's like a communal well because they don't necessarily have wells. And so that's,
right, we're told to wash your hands, but how do you do it in that situation? Very similar to what's going on in Flint, right, in Detroit with African-American communities, with the lack of access to clean water, raising rates of COVID-19 infection, right?
So drilling wells is one of the things I think that's been prioritized, at least by the Navajo Nation, if not by the federal government. And I think on that American Indian Health Board website, there are links to find out more about those projects and even donating. So for that being a particular, I guess, place to think about, one of the things that was going on, the Navajo Nation was setting up checkpoints. Some of the local towns the non-native towns were just violating those, just driving right through, not honoring the checkpoints and those types of things. Same with out in the Dakotas. And so, I think part of what this says is that we are connected. We live alongside each other. The virus doesn't have, and not only that, we not only live alongside each other as Native nations to states and cities and so on, but we're interacting all the time, and I think protecting ourselves is also, and making those types of decisions for ourselves and our communities, our families, also impacts our neighbors that we have to really be concerned and careful about as well. I think these are ongoing conversations, within the presbyteries, within congregations, and I think that's one of the things that I'm glad to see is that so many congregations are taking this really seriously within the Presbyterian Church. And I just encourage more of that, and to expand that sense of who is my neighbor, thinking about other communities within the city or the area, the town, Native nations who are here in the Northeast, finding out like what's going on, and how are we all kind of responding and navigating this together.
Yeah, it's definitely a moment for that, and also a moment of significant noticing of the ways those disparities are showing up still throughout our health system, and not just noticing, but the question is, people of faith is, why does that matter to us? And the neighbor question is a big piece of why that should matter. The baptism question is a big piece of why that should matter, and not just matter, but be something that we get into some sort of more of an activist frame around, because there's a calling to repair and to heal as well. So this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much, Anthony, for being part of this with us. It's been, there's so many things we could keep talking about. I know when you and I get on the phone, sometimes we're like, oh my gosh, it's been 2 hours, because there's so many things to talk about. But I hope this is a conversation we can continue. And I also hope that this is not meant to replace the blanket exercise in any way that we would have been doing as a presbytery, but we also want to make sure that we continue to keep these conversations in our minds. And even though we could not do the blanket exercise as a presbytery this month because of the physical distancing, to make sure that we highlighted and looked at some of the things that might have been brought up by the blanket exercise, and made sure that we continued to do that work of prayerful exploration, of thinking through what's really going on and what is our role as Reformed Christians, as people who follow Jesus in this time and in this place and in this space. So thank you so much for helping us think through some of these pieces. I hope that, I know that when we are able to be physically back together again, that this will be one of the things that we will be doing as a presbytery. It's a commitment that we've made, but it's one we've had to put on hold for a little while for doing this blanket exercise piece. But I am looking forward to the day that we can come back together, and I'm looking forward to the day that we can be back together in a safe way, medically, and that we can do some of these other larger pieces of exploration and community building together in that way. Anything else you'd like to share with us as we wrap up for today?
I think just to point to some resources. So as I mentioned, I'll be sending along to you a list of a collection of resources that go over a whole variety of topics, from what is sovereignty, to Doctrine of Discovery and all the different denominations and their statements, including Presbyterian Church, mascots, arts, and a whole range of things. I think what's really, really important is that people take the time first to educate yourselves. There are so many resources out there. I think what can often happen is people bring somebody in and say, hey, teach us about you, like before, like
right.
reaching out to, say, one of the local tribes, like, tell us about your history. Well, there's so much. There's so much already online. So the first step is really to educate yourself with the resources, and myself. I mean, this has been a whole learning process for me, being a guest again in this area. And so I think some of the things, the resources that I'll be sending over to you are a good way to start that process. Within the Presbyterian Church, the Office for Native American and Congregational Support has resources about some of the committees, the initiatives, the work that's being done among Native communities, including, I believe, the Doctrine of Discovery. There's a whole big publication that's been put out on that. Irv, again, is a great person to be in contact with, and there's even a speakers bureau. I'm on that bureau. And I think that's a good way to do local conversations, even. And then also to think about like some of these ways of advocacy, which is, whether that's writing letters to government, local officials on anything from mascots to tribal, like Mashpee, and keeping their sovereignty. These are the people that represent us, and they're right now they're making these decisions that will have huge effects on Native communities. So there's a lot of resources. I mean, there's like scripts that people can just like say, hey, if you don't know what to say, it's there for you. Donating is an option. Whether, looking to some of the local communities out here, or the American Indian Health Board. There are opportunities like that. So these are just some of the ways I think that people can continue to be in conversation. Read.
Right.
So many good things.
Presbyterians usually love to read a book.
Thank you, I really appreciate you inviting me to this conversation. I know it's been
welcome. You're so welcome. Yeah, and I would be remiss if I mentioned, I mean, we talked at the beginning about the General Assembly, and your team's been doing work since the last assembly. So much, we have a number of study committees and reports that were to come to this assembly on a variety of topics, this being one of them, that have been essentially tabled to the next assembly, so that we have this very pared down assembly this year. But we will be electing a moderator or co-moderator team at this assembly coming up. And so we have one of our Native pastors and leaders in the denomination. So do you want to say anything about that? Because that's certainly something to note as we head into this assembly.
I would, I'll let you go ahead and speak to that, because I'm not I don't know the most recent information there.
Yeah. So Alona Street Stewart is one of the folks running for moderator. She's part of a co-mod team, and I should have pulled it up beforehand so that I could remember the name of the person she's running with. Alona's a ruling elder. She's running with a teaching elder from Alabama, whose name I am forgetting right now, but she's one of a few folks that is deciding to stand for moderator. And Alona is the synod leader for Synod of Lakes and Prairies, which is out in the upper Midwest, and has been someone I've known through both mid-council work, but other areas of work in the denomination, and someone who's I've regarded as a very deep thinker, and also as a very significant leader among us in the larger church. And so we've had a number of firsts in moderator elections in recent years, and so it'll be interesting to see what this assembly does with this, and the stories that are told on the 19th of June when that virtual town hall happens, which is also going to be a first for the denomination, and doing elections electronically this way. So so it's going to be very interesting, and I'm looking forward to the larger denomination beginning to hear Alona's story, and there's a number of really interesting folks running this year, but certainly I'm always interested when someone runs who I know in this way, and who will help us continue to hear with different ears as a denomination, something I'm always very interested in. So we shall see. That's about, well, it's about a month away at this point, the General Assembly. So
Wow.
to be very different for all of us. So thank you again. We're so glad you're here with us in the Presbytery. I know you're officially, Anthony, a member of New York City Presbytery, our neighbor to the south, but we're so glad you've been part of us and offered your gifts with First Presbyterian in Hartford. And I know you're going to continue living in the Hartford area while working on your PhD at Harvard. And so a friend in our presbytery, and a co-worker and a co-sojourner along this journey with us as a presbytery. So thanks for being with us today, and please stay well, you and your family, and blessings to your brother and his ministry of health service. I'm sure he's doing a lot, and so our prayers certainly go with him in this time. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, all the same to you.
Thanks.
All right, take care.